Hello everyone, today I'm going to be ranking all of the legends from best to worst and explaining all of their abilities. The primary factor in how I'm ranking the legends is based on their versatility and average performance. I know some people might be upset that I have their favorite character low on the list, but this is just my opinion on if you were to play 1,000 games of Apex, for example, how much value would you get out of each character? I will say that some of this boils down to what variation of Apex you're playing them in. There are some instances like with Caustic where if you're playing him in a tournament match on World's Edge, he's very strong, but then if you play him in ranked on Olympus, he honestly becomes a liability. I also want to mention that character metas can change very quickly, and there are plenty of examples of lower tier characters performing very well on the leaderboard or in tournaments, and I'll mention some of those cases when we get there. There's also examples of characters going from being considered useless to overpowered without receiving any buffs or nerfs like we saw with Seer, so keep all that in mind. I'm going to start from the bottom of the list and work my way to the top. Starting off with what I believe to be the worst legend in the game, we have Ashe. Conceptually, Ashe's abilities are good. However, in practice, getting value out of her abilities has always proven to be very difficult. Ashe's ultimate creates a one-way portal wherever she has her crosshair, but there's a lot of downsides. For one, the portal placing is really buggy, inconsistent, and hard to aim if you have stick drift. Your enemies can also see where the end of the portal is before you actually show up there, which a lot of the time leads to it being nade stacked or pre-aimed and your whole team just exploding. Her snare is also much harder than you would think to get value out of. If they're far away, it doesn't last long enough to close the gap, and if they're close to you, you probably don't even need to snare them anyways. It usually only gets value if you manage to snare someone who was already committed to running away. Her current perks don't buff the snare as much as they need to. However, a snare in a game like Apex is a high frustration ability, so I wouldn't be surprised if it's weak on purpose. If you're going to try and make Ashe work, you need to have a good mix of area control and aggression on your team. Characters like Bangalore are great because her abilities can be used offensively to support Ashe pushing while also compensating for her having essentially zero defensive utility. Stormpoint, Kings Canyon, and World's Edge are the only maps where I think she's playable. They have more cover and are generally better angles for aggressive playstyles. Olympus and Broken Moon are just too open. It's hard to place the portal in a spot where the lobby can't see it. It's also problematic that she's supposed to be a hyper aggressive character, but her ultimate is incredibly telegraphed, a long cooldown, and incredibly limited. What makes things like Wraith Phase and Rev Jump so useful for fighting is that the player essentially has infinite options on how to use them, whereas Ashe Portal requires LOS to go anywhere and resets all your momentum when you exit the portal, and also there's a chance it just bugs out and goes nowhere near where you placed it. Ashe's passive is just short of being useless. It's hard to find any opportunity to use it. Even when you do, the team is almost always halfway across the map. Compare that to recon characters that can scan every team in the lobby in a much more consistent way. Her passive was just a huge victim of power creep while also not being that good even before then. This is a take I think most people will disagree with me on. I think Gibraltar is one of the worst characters in the game for one very specific reason, which I'll talk about in a moment. Now, I'm not going to deny that he has 3 of the strongest abilities in the game. Gibraltar's bubble is flat out the best ability in the game in my opinion. It can be used in so many ways. Throw it on an injured teammate, throw it between your opponents so you can push them, throw it down in an endgame scenario to stall time, and so much more. You can really get creative with this ability. The skill ceiling for it is really high. You do have to be a little careful though, because it can't be used equally by both you and your enemies. The only real advantage you have is that you choose where it goes, which is a concept that I wish more games would do with their abilities. Gibraltar's ultimate calls down an airstrike that does enough damage to wipe out full teams. It's also super OP in endgame scenarios when dodging it becomes basically impossible. His gun shield is another ability that competes for best in the game. It is miles ahead of most abilities in the game, being able to block up to 50 damage if Gibraltar's aiming down sights. With all that being said, I still think that he is a very weak character and probably will be for the foreseeable future. Now, this may be obvious, but the main downside to Gibraltar is that his hitbox is just absolutely gigantic. The fortified passive simply does not make up for his hitbox being twice as big as other legends. When you're twice as big, you're going to get hit by twice as many bullets, and honestly, it's likely more than that, but I'm just assuming it's a linear increase for argument's sake. I know there's a lot of Gibraltar fans who put him in B, A, or even S tier, but in my experience playing him and playing against him, I just consistently see him have some of the worst results in today's meta. While his abilities are strong, the cooldowns on them are very long, and good teams know how to take advantage of that and other weaknesses really well, to the point where Gibby often just becomes a liability. He is also a very fuel-reliant character, as in he needs more resources to be effective than most. If you're early rotating with blue armors and low meds, his hitbox becomes a huge problem, as you can get blood out of meds very easily. Ideally on Gibraltar, you want to be paired with a strong rotation character and another fighting character. Comps like Valkyrie, Horizon, Gibby, for example, benefit him a lot. A strong rotation character is essential because if you've ever tried making a sketchy cross, you'll know that everyone just focuses you because you're so easy to hit, and you want a strong fighting character because Gibby is forced to anchor most of the time, so you'll need someone to balance that out. Or you can commit to a full defensive comp with a Wattson or Caustic instead, but if you're doing that, you're essentially forced to play Valkyrie as your third, which may or may not be a problem. As many of you may remember, he had his time in the spotlight in the early seasons of the game. His abilities were much stronger and there were less characters that could counter him. Horizon, Seer, and Maggie hard counter Gibraltar. If you're the only Gibraltar in the lobby, there's some merit because you can make some plays that nobody else is able to, but if Gibby ever becomes remotely popular again, people will likely just begin picking up counter picks like Maggie, and he'll fall back into obscurity. It's very unlikely we'll see him return to his peaks anytime soon. This will probably be back-to-back hot takes, but Vantage for me is at the top of F tier. The main problem with Vantage is that she performs really poorly in close range engagements and final ring scenarios, which is two of the most important things in the game. The sniper is essentially unusable in close quarters, and her tactical doesn't fare much better due to a long windup window and just flat out inconsistency. The bird can easily get stuck on things if there's extreme difference in elevation. Another problem with Vantage's abilities is that they're incredibly telegraphed. Her ultimate has a massive laser wherever you're aiming, and when you try using it against good players, it simply just won't peak. Especially if you manage to hit them once, then they definitely won't peak for you to hit a second one, unless they're in a spot where cover isn't an option, such as an open field or taking a redeploy balloon, which in all fairness, it is the best gun in the game at knocking someone off a balloon. It is almost a guaranteed knock if you catch someone doing it. However, this is niche, and let's be honest, if someone's trying to take a balloon in front of you, they're not a big threat anyways usually. It can often end up being a meaningless elim. So with that being said, if a weapon is only best in slot when the enemy has no way of firing back at you or has no cover, it's probably not a good idea to base your whole playstyle or gameplay around it. One thing I don't see Vantage players do often enough is fake the bird throw. It's a super telegraphed ability and you'll almost always expect them to follow it shortly after. So you can throw it a random direction or throw it one way then run the other, and it's something that catches people off guard. I've actually never seen anyone do it other than myself, but it's not like Vantage is a very popular character anyway. Like I mentioned before, she is lackluster in endgame scenarios. When I'm doing my every legend challenges, Vantage is always one of the most frustrating because the early to mid game goes really well, and then closing out the end game is super difficult. She is a decent character for the first half or first 3/4 of the match, but when it comes down to a tight round 6 circle, my abilities are essentially useless, and the large hitbox makes it difficult to make plays, especially when I'm playing against characters like Rev or Conduit that have similar or smaller hitboxes with 300 plus HP, or I'm getting Caustic ulted and the ring is so small my jump would send me flying out of the zone, so I just have to stay there and get farmed. The main thing she does have going for her though, at least at the moment, is she's able to scan both beacons upon reaching blue armor. This would be an insanely OP ability if it was on a character that was good at playing end zone. Vantage, however, like I said, is not, which I assume is just a way of balancing it. If this was given to a character like Bloodhound or any of the controller characters, it would be so insanely broken, but she's seen very little competitive play. I can only remember a single team even trying her maybe a year or two ago. They actually managed to qualify for NA Pro League playing Gibraltar, Valkyrie, Vantage, but the 3 players on that team were good enough, in my opinion, to qual with just a normal comp, and I think they swapped once Pro League started, so I didn't look too much into it. If I was going to play Vantage seriously, I would probably try a Conduit Rev Vantage comp maybe. You get both beacons and a hyper-aggressive duo to follow up on your Vantage snipes. It's probably a decent comp to be honest, but just inferior to Bloodhound with an extra scan beacon. Bloodhound would just get way more value in tight scenarios and endgames. So for me, I've got her very low on the list. Octane is way more fun than he is viable. While his abilities are good, both of them have huge drawbacks that push him out of competitive viability. His stim ability is a good ability, great for closing gaps, making escapes, and giving yourself a strafe speed advantage in a 1v1. However, it comes with a drawback of costing Octane a good chunk of his HP, and in almost every scenario you want to Octane stim, having HP is probably very important. You're stimming to dodge bullets, but the only reason you want to dodge the bullets is because they do damage, but the stim also does damage. Obviously, the stim has the potential to save you from more than damage will deal, but you get my point. There are also tons of other characters that have better movement abilities that don't do damage to themselves. Pathfinder's Grapple, Wraith Phase, Revenant Leap don't have any side effects. Octane's Jump Pad is an ability that is simply a victim of power creep and an increase in the skill of the average player. While it does give you and your team a good movement tool, it comes with the downside of making you essentially helpless while using it. Accuracy while airborne is greatly reduced, and players have gotten much better at beaming others out of the air. I think as the general player base improves the game and legends with superior team movement abilities come out, Octane will fall even further and further down the list. One thing I would like to see with him is a perk that slightly reduces damage taken after hitting a jump pad. That would make it far less risky to use and make him a more popular pick for team-based play. His passive is simply below average. While regenerating HP is cool, it's really only needed because his tactical is so painful. Changing it to where it regenerates 5% of your missing HP per tick, capped at a minimum of 1, instead of just always doing 1 per per tick is something I personally thought would be interesting. Octane has seen a fair amount of competitive play before characters like Horizon and Bangalore entered the meta. Octane Bloodhound Gibraltar was a popular comp that saw lots of success after his pad was changed to have two different trajectories you could choose from. However, the release of Valkyrie saw Octane fall out of the meta to just never return. Wraith, Horizon, and Bangalore are just better options for short rotates and edge teams, and Valkyrie is better for teams that want to early rotate and camp. He's probably the biggest victim of power creep in Apex. I don't recall him ever really getting nerfed, and he went from a top competitive pick to absolute zero. If you're going to play him in a competitive environment or ranked, it's better to pair him with characters that can benefit from his hyper-aggressive abilities. Horizon, Crypto, Bangalore, and Bloodhound, even Conduit are good choices. However, if you want to play aggressive, you're better off just playing the characters I named, as they either have better movement abilities or pack more firepower. Still in E tier, I've got Mirage. While Mirage's abilities can work against weaker players, more experienced opponents don't fall for his clone near as often. I will say, if you're playing against weaker competition, Mirage is higher than E tier, maybe B or even low A tier, but it doesn't seem fair to rate him highly if he's only good against weaker players. His passive makes you and your teammate invisible while reviving. The invisibility lasts for a few seconds after reviving or after pulling out your weapon. While this sounds really useful, the audio cue for it is incredibly loud, and most of the time I'm able to tell exactly where the revive is, even if they're invisible. This also works on respawn beacons, which is rarely useful. Mirage's tactical sends out a single clone. It goes in a straight line, but has a toggle feature that switches it to mimic Mirage. This ability is mainly used for scouting, but you can throw it ahead of you when running through fields or to just try and trick people. His ultimate makes him temporarily invisible, then spawns multiple clones that mimic his movements. There's a small flash on the real Mirage that is pretty easy to see if you know what you're looking for. Pro players are rarely confused by the tactical, and they're really good at guessing which ultimate clone is the real one. All of his abilities are simply just bottom 5. The only thing that stops him from being the worst character in the game is that his abilities are incredibly low cooldown. Also, if you're in a fight that's really chaotic, his ultimate can get a lot of value, but in tougher lobbies, the fights tend to be way more structured and leave little room for his army of clones to cause any meaningful confusion. Generally, the chaos needed for Mirage to thrive is something that good players will tend to avoid. If you want consistency in your gameplay, you want slow, methodical play with high impact abilities like Horizon and Caustic ults being used in tandem to create these powerful attacks. Whereas Mirage's abilities are just him spamming holograms that aren't able to actually impact your enemies directly. If the enemy doesn't engage with your clones or quickly learns which one is you, your character ends up getting no value. I like to compare it to trying to hurt someone's feelings versus just punching them in the mouth, where the Mirage clones are you trying to hurt their feelings, trick them, whereas hitting them with a Caustic ult is like punching them in the mouth. You know, it's always going to get value. You're always going to be able to punch someone in the mouth, but you might not be able to hurt their feelings, if that makes any sense. The clones are also prone to just instantly dying or running into a wall for their entire lifetime, or even being detrimental to Mirage and giving away what he's doing. If all your clones are crouching and don't change the direction they're looking, it's likely that you're hiding behind something small, giving your enemies a better idea of where you could be. I do think that he has a small niche as a counter to meta characters like Seer and Bloodhound. However, giving up a whole legend to have a soft counter to characters that the enemy isn't guaranteed to have to begin with isn't really worth it. I think if his clones mimicked more of his actions, it would make him more convincing and thus get more value. A lot of the times the clones will do random stuff like run directly into walls or get bugged out when the player does something they're not able to mimic. If the clones could climb walls or even occasionally shoot, I could see him being played more in ranked. However, I find it very unlikely that he'll ever see any real competitive viability or even playtime in his current state. I do think he's a really fun legend though, and I wouldn't want to see him change just because he isn't good in the top 1% or top 5% of players. I think there's an interesting conversation to be had about reverting his ultimate to what it was near release. Essentially, he'd ult and he'd be invisible with his gun holstered, and when he pulled his weapon out, he'd be visible again. Having him fill an assassin role would honestly be a really cool addition to the game. You can even move his current ultimate to his tactical with maybe a 34-second cooldown, then return his invisibility back to his ultimate. I think that would be pretty sick. Overall, he's an interesting character being held back by low impact abilities. Ballistic is one of the few legends in the game who've never really had a place in the spotlight. He was basically dead on arrival when added to the game, and I think a lot of the reason for that is because his main appeal, his Q, is an incredibly high frustration ability. After getting hit by it, shooting too much will cause your weapon to overheat and jam for a few seconds, as well as dealing a small amount of damage. Imagine how annoying this would be to play against if he was OP and there was 20 of them in the lobby. It would be old Seer levels of frustration and suck a lot of fun out of the game. I think this is partially why he was released in a weak state and hasn't really seen much help since then. Barring a rework, I just don't think he'll ever be a meta character because his main appeal removes a core mechanic of the game. That was a bit of a side tangent, but as for what makes him weak, his Q is simply too easy to play around. If you're firing it from a distance, it's relatively easy to dodge and only affects one player on the enemy team. There is a trick to kind of bend it around objects, but it's not too reliable. If they're close to you, it isn't hard to hit, but will usually require you to fire it while you yourself are shooting, and it can be hard do both at the same time. Even when the Q lands, people can go behind cover and overheat the gun on purpose to quickly cleanse it. I'm not saying it doesn't get any value, I'm just saying that it's incredibly hard to get it out. If it was an AoE that could affect multiple people, it would be solid, but then that leads into the high frustration thing I mentioned earlier. His passive allows him to carry a third weapon, and his ultimate grants gold attachments to that weapon, as well as providing reload speed and handling speed to any ally near Ballistic. The main problem is that there are simply better fighting ultimates in the game. We're reaching a point in Apex where people are really cracked at aiming and controlling recoil, so eliminating people with abilities is much more reliable, because it's much harder to choke an ability throw, for an example, than it is a spray. A Horizon ult or Caustic ult will turn the tides of a fight far more often than slightly better weapon handling for your team, and you wouldn't want to stock up Ballistic and a Horizon because then you're losing something else. If you only bring firepower, you'll lose survivability, beacon scans, etc. There was a short period of time where Oxygen Gaming was playing Ballistic in a Bangalore Bloodhound Ballistic comp. I didn't watch any of their matches, but I think they actually placed top 5 a few of the scrim days, so you can win with Ballistic. I just believe there's better options, and clearly Oxygen did as well because they didn't stick with him for too long. Overall, I think his weaknesses come from a frustrating design concept similar to Roadhog or Zed, where if he's meta, it'll create a frustrating environment for casuals, so he's left weak on purpose. I've played him a few times during solo to pred challenges and during my every legend challenges, and I'm usually not too inspired to keep playing him, even though I like playing off meta legends. The Q is just clunky, hard to use, and unreliable. His ult is fun, but there are other legends with equally fun ultimates that just get more value. It's possible we see a Ballistic rework in the future, but I wouldn't expect any major buffs, so for me, he's at the end of E tier. This might be controversial for some people, but I think almost all top players and ranked grinders would agree that Wraith simply doesn't bring as much value in a team environment. Her passive is essentially useless and most of the time doesn't even work properly. It's supposed to notify you if someone is aiming at you or if there's some sort of danger, but any Wraith main will vouch and say that it just simply doesn't do a good job. Her Q is purely a selfish ability that on its own has very little impact on the game. There's other characters that can entry frag whose abilities have direct impact and are multi-purpose. Bangalore has her passive and smokes that allow her to entry frag effectively while also providing other value for the team, such as smoking for a res, a rotate, or blocking off an LOS. The real reason you would pick Wraith in a competitive setting is for her portal. It's by far the most versatile ability in the game. The creative ways people have learned how to use the portal over the years is cool to see. It can block doors, you can kidnap people into your team, you can use it to hold an off angle far away from your team, you can portal into a fight as a third party and use it to quickly get back to your spot if it goes bad. I mean, it's almost endless. However, even with all those things that Wraith can do with her abilities, the problem I see personally is that she isn't the best at any one thing in particular. She doesn't provide the best rotate tool. She's not the best entry frag. She's not the best team fighter. She does a lot of things well, but nothing else that someone else can't do better. If you need a rotate tool, you have Bangalore or Valkyrie. If you need a team fighter, you can have a Bloodhound or Horizon. And if you need a hard entry frag, you can use characters like Revenant. She doesn't really fit into any modern ways of playing the game. The need for an entry frag / rotation hybrid just doesn't really fit. If you think of all the meta characters over the years, they're generally meta because they do one thing so well, they're essentially irreplaceable. If you look at Caustic, for example, he's bounced in and out of the meta a few times, but when he's strong, he is just ridiculous. Nobody does Caustic's job anywhere close to as good as him. If you need close quarters area control or you need to take space from someone, Caustic Gas has almost no counterplay and you can't stop it other than a Wattson gen, whereas Wraith's abilities have lots of counterplay and tons of characters do her jobs better. I still would consider Wraith as a viable character. I mean, there are still a handful of teams doing well with her. DSG finished 3rd in North America while playing Wraith Bloodhound Rampart comp, which is pretty based, but all 3 of their players are very talented, and I think their unique comp has a very small part in their success. I will touch on one thing though with Wraith, and that's how I really do believe that most characters in this game are viable, meaning the character isn't going to hold you back really in any way. So if a D tier character really fits your playstyle or you enjoy playing them, don't stop playing them just because it's not popular. Think about how you're trying to play the game and what tools your teams need to succeed. A team landing landslide needs to play a lot differently than a team who lands lightning rod every game, as an example. Wraith is probably the best example of good depending on the circumstances, so keep that in mind when choosing which legend to play and just in general for the rest of the video. Maggie is a legend that I wish was played more, and to be honest, I think I know why she's not played as much. Reason being, her abilities are the easiest in the game to just completely miss, which turns players off away from learning how to properly use them. In all fairness though, her abilities are very frustrating to use. Maggie's tactical fires a drill that latches onto whoever it touches and sprays fire on the opposite side of the drill. This ability is inconsistent to say the least. On some maps more than others, characters, does a lot of trial and error while trying to learn what the drill will actually pierce and what has bad internal geometry that causes it to bug out. The damage hitbox and the fire hitbox are separate for some reason, and sometimes the damage hitbox will get stuck on something inside if the object is shaped weird. There's a couple theories for this, but what I think often happens is that some of the objects were made before Maggie existed, and so instead of being single objects that the drill will pierce, they are multiple objects stitched together to look like a new object, so the game just takes up less space when you download it. This is often done with rocks, and holy moly is the drill bad at piercing some of the rocks, especially on World's Edge and Kings Canyon. I've lost so many games to the Maggie drill just not doing its job. I've literally gotten knocked by people who are standing in the fire not taking damage while they shoot at me. Maggie's ultimate throws a ball that leaves speed boosting pads wherever it bounces. It explodes upon hitting an enemy, launching them a short distance and stunning them for a few seconds. The stun radius is actually quite large. It also has the ability to break terrain creation abilities like Newcastle Wall and Gibby Dome, so she could potentially be used as a counter pick in the future if those characters come back. The problem with the ball is that it has a bad tendency to go the complete wrong direction, but this is usually due to user error. Emphasis on usually. Maggie's passive has two parts. The first is it removes the movement penalty from holding a shotgun. This would actually be a great passive if shotguns weren't completely outshined by SMGs. In my opinion, SMGs are so much better than shotguns that they're not worth using even on Maggie. The second part of the passive is that it highlights any enemy you damage for a short duration. This sounds kind of useless, which it mostly is, but will occasionally net you a knock you wouldn't have otherwise gotten. For example, if a person runs through a smoke or a catalyst wall as you're firing at them and you're able to keep tracking them because of it. It also makes it slightly easier to hit big sprays on people because the outline will make it slightly easier to hit the bullets after the first one. I think of all the legends, Maggie is definitely the one with the most untapped potential. I think if someone really talented was to spend a few hundred hours learning how to throw the ball more consistently and learn more about how to shoot the drill so it bugs out less, I genuinely think there's a chance they could start a meta shift similar to Seer. Not quite to the same extent, but definitely noticeable. I think the learning curve for her is just very frustrating. There's also the possibility that shotguns get buffed in the future, which could propel her further up the tier list, but for now, I have her solidly in D tier. Crypto is probably the most underplayed legend in the game in my opinion. I don't think he's a one-size-fits-all character that everyone should play, but in the right scenarios, he's a decent option. I've played him some during a few of my rank 1 grinds, and I've done very well with him. Personally, I think he's kind of boring though, so when I'm streaming, I don't want to be AFK going in and out of the drone while there's lots of people watching and expecting me to do something cool. So I'll play him for just a few games here and there and almost always do well. I think the main thing he has going for him is that his pick rate is so low and almost nobody is good at him. So if you are good at crypto, you can get a lot of value because teams just aren't good at dealing with him. His drone is the best info gatherer in the game and can be used to help scout out rotates and see how many teams are in the area. You can fly at like 50 meters in the air and see every direction for hundreds of meters, which in a battle royale is incredibly valuable info to have. You can also throw the drone at people if you're about to push them, which is one thing I see almost no crypto players do. If you've already EMP'd or you don't think you'll need it, you can just throw the drone at someone, even for a brief scan or a permanent area scan if they choose not to shoot it. If the drone does get broken, you essentially don't have abilities, so be careful if you're going to use it or put it anywhere risky. The EMP is good for obvious reasons. It stuns and does 50 damage to enemies in a large radius. It also destroys most abilities. Gibby Bubble, Wattson Gen, etc. all get destroyed by Crypto's ult. You can put people in a really tough position by flying the drone high over their head after you EMP them. It makes it really hard to shoot, and if they're shooting at the drone, just keep flying it around and scanning them, because if they're down 50 HP and staring into the air while on scan, they're just free licks for your teammates. One thing that people used to do with Crypto that's kind of fallen out of favor, and I didn't really like personally, is pairing him with a character like Wraith, Octane, or Ashe. The idea is that they'll drop the ult near Crypto when he's in the drone, so after he EMPs, he can immediately use it to close the gap. This has worked in the past with Crypto, Revenant, Octane comps, but in the current meta, I think it's kind of gimmicky, and while it can be strong in certain scenarios, there's just better options that will yield more results over a long period of time. If I was going to play Crypto, I'd probably want like a Revenant Bloodhound on my team, just 2 raid bosses that can easily capitalize on my entry damage. The main problem with Crypto and why I have him so low is that, like I said, without his EMP or his drone, he's pretty useless. So in any chaotic scenarios where you don't have time to place a good EMP, or you're getting third-partied, or you're making a tough rotate, he's kind of just a meat bag. And what I've realized from playing this game for a long time is that it doesn't matter how good a character is in the best case scenario, it matters how good they are in the worst case scenario. So yeah, you can early rotate with Crypto and get a good spot, then use the drone to hit a nice EMP third party and secure loot for your team. But when everything falls apart and the second-to-second decisions matter, Crypto is severely lacking. What makes characters like Revenant and Bloodhound so good is that they're really scrappy and adaptable to the scenario. Crypto kind of needs almost everything to be going right for him to be useful, which in fairness, you have the best info gathering tool in the game, so it's easier for him to be in a good spot than other characters. But even with that much info, unexpected things still happen, and Crypto doesn't hold up as well as does most other characters. Loba is a tough character for me to rank because she moves from S tier to F tier depending on the game mode you're playing. If you're solo queuing ranked, for example, she's as easy S tier legend has been for multiple years. On the other hand, if you're playing a tournament, she is pretty bad, D or F tier in my opinion. Her passive allows you to see high tier loot through walls, which is much more convenience than anything else. Her ultimate has a trick where you can ping an item, exit the ult, then hold the ping button, and it'll literally point to where that item is, which makes her passive quite a bit less valuable. If this ever gets fixed, I could see the passive being moderately useful. Her tactical throws a bracelet that will teleport you to wherever it lands. This is almost completely useless during fighting and is generally used for rotating around the map, running away from fights when your teammates get bodied, which happens a lot in solo queue. Her ultimate though is the reason I think most people play her, and there's a few things I want to talk about regarding it. Loba's ultimate allows you to pull any 2 items within a large radius around it. Obviously, there's the plus side of getting 2 upgrades, but it does something else I've noticed. When you place it down, it gives your team an incentive to kind of slow down and group. In a solo queue environment, getting your teammates to do any sort of cooperation is hard. But with Loba, you're kind of dangling the treat in front of them, and it'll get them to actually listen to you and not just run off on their own. Also in solo queue, it's almost impossible to trade all the items you need. For example, maybe your Caustic doesn't have a mic or can't speak the same language. Maybe your Bloodhound wants ult excels, but your Wattson is hoarding them. Or maybe someone doesn't have any med kits. But with Loba's shop, you can just grab what you need without having to try and communicate it. In an ideal world where everyone communicates effectively, this doesn't really matter, but any frequent solo queuer knows that that rarely happens. In a tournament setting, Loba loses a lot of value because everyone can trade things they need easily and your inventory is more shared. You also don't have to rat as much as you would in solo queue. Loba is also one of the best characters for resetting your knocked teammates and just simply ratting, which is pretty rare in high level lobbies. And quite honestly, when I do my solo queue challenges, I've played a lot of Loba and that's the only reason that I play her. If you are solo queuing with her, I would recommend that you play very slow and take a solid long range weapon like a G7 or repeater. Stay further away than you normally would and just look for raw damage output. Go in if someone gets a large opening. If not, just kind of chill, play off your teammates. Some games you'll pop off and sometimes your level 150 teammate will get one clipped by a max level 3-time Apex Predator pro player. And in those scenarios, you can just use your tactical to run away and try and reset your teammates. Loba's performance varies the most of any legend, I would say. So it's hard for me to recommend her or say she's bad. It just depends on what you're doing. There's times I'm doing something like a solo to pred challenge where I'll play her for every game. And there's seasons where I'm 3-stacking ranked with 2 other pro players and I won't play her a single game. I feel like a middle C tier rating is fair for that reason. Despite being one of my favorite legends in the game, I've got Newcastle in the C tier. His passive enhances your reviving animation, allowing you to put up your own knockdown shield to protect your teammate. This ability is really OP and is the main reason a lot of people play him. His tactical places a mobile shield that blocks an absurd amount of damage. Ideally, you use this in tandem with your other 2 abilities to make them stronger. It's especially good when trying to res one of your teammates. His ultimate allows him to leap and place an energized wall. This wall stuns enemies who come into contact with it and does a small amount of damage. The leap range is also increased if you're aiming at one of your teammates. The simplest way to explain why I have him so low is that he's mostly a character that exists to fix mistakes or make you lose less. For example, your teammate gets knocked, you have an easier time rezzing him, you're in a bad spot, you can drop the ult to have cover. Obviously, there are scenarios where you can make proactive plays with Newcastle, but in general, his abilities are strictly defensive, which in my opinion isn't something you're going to want in a lot of scenarios. It's generally better to have characters that are focused on creating advantage. For example, a Horizon ult, a Bangalore ult, a Bloodhound ult. All of these abilities are able to create openings and put your team ahead, whereas Newcastle will almost purely be a savior type character in most engagements. I think if he had a normal size hitbox, he would be one of the best and most fun characters in the game. Because his abilities could be multi-purpose and used as engaging tools, Jiggle peeking off a mobile shield and his ultimate with a shotgun are fairly strong already. So with a Lifeline or a Bangalore size hitbox, he'd be nuts and very fun. Some POIs have an increased chance to spawn gold knockdown shields, making him one of the few characters that are significantly impacted by the place they land. Landing trials for a guaranteed gold knockdown shield is what you want to be doing if you're playing Newcastle. It essentially lets you guarantee a safe res if the enemy isn't directly on top of you, and even if they are directly on top of you, you can still get the res off sometimes and turn the fight around on them. I think Newcastle's biggest strengths come from his endgame utility. A lot of endgames come down to who runs out of cover first and is forced to make a play. But with Newcastle, you can add cover wherever you want, and if you pair him with a Wattson, you are essentially unmovable in endgames. If you're wanting to play hyper aggressive with a revive character, you're better off running Lifeline or maybe even a Mirage. Those 2 characters are going to be able to put out more damage and stay alive longer during chaotic fights. Newcastle really needs control and predictability because getting caught out is so punishing for him. So if you're not able to find those scenarios, then you'd just be better off playing a character that's going to get hit by less bullets. I have played a good amount of him during my pred grinds, and while there are pop-off moments and clutches with his his utility, I think over the long run, he just brings less value on average than other alternatives. One thing I think players should do more often to get more value out of him is using the res as bait. People will often spray the revive shield to stop it, and while they're reloading, you can cancel the res, fire your magazine, and start resing them again. Pretty niche trick, but it can make a difference, and I've seen it work personally. I do think he is slightly underplayed for how strong he is, and if the meta ever moves away from rewarding hyper aggression, I think you'll see a boost in his pick and win rates. Next up in C tier, I've got Rampart. Rampart's passive adds more bullets to LMGs and increases the reload speed, which is kind of pointless when you think about it, because the main selling point of LMGs is that you have more bullets than you need and usually won't need to reload them. The reload time on them honestly isn't even that bad to begin with, because how often are you getting knocked and going, geez, if only my Spitfire had 5 more bullets? It's just really not that common and not that useful. Rampart's tactical is her Rampart walls, which are honestly really good, particularly on Broken Moon. On Broken Moon, I think Rampart is high A tier or maybe even S tier. A lot of the buildings on that map are designed to be difficult to hold with open rooftops, but slapping a few Rampart walls on them makes it so teams have a hard time pushing you, so much so that they'll usually just leave you alone in my experience. You want to avoid as much conflict as possible on that map because the lack of cover makes it hard to address any third or fourth parties, and with Rampart, you can just make your own cover whenever you need it. Her ultimate is her massive machine gun, and this ultimate is extremely hit or miss. The deployable turret is almost completely useless, and I can't recall a single time I've seen someone get anything more than comedic value out of using the mounted gun. The ult's best use is for shooting at balloons, cars, or just sliding out of cover and letting it rip on someone you think isn't going to expect you to be there. If you're firing at someone and it's a completely even fight, you will lose almost every time because your strafe speed is so bad that you're basically standing still. They're not going to miss any bullets on you. If you're able to get the drop on them though, it's really devastating. But if you're getting the drop on someone hard enough that you'll be able to spool up a Sheila, most of the time you'll be able to do significant damage to them with a traditional weapon. I'm not going to downplay the potential of the turret. It does have its moments. I just think that the average value you'll get is a lot lower than other abilities. Despite being a heavily defensive character, I think early rotating with Rampart isn't always a good idea. If you have blue armors in the middle of end zone and a red or purple armor team, super geared up team pulls up on you with lots of meds, Horizon's ult, Caustic ult, etc., you can get very easily overwhelmed. The best way to play Rampart, in my opinion, is to just loot up, get purple armors, all your meds, scopes, things like that, and then use an ability like a Valkyrie ult or a Wraith portal to just slam into a good spot, anywhere from ring 2 to 4. That way, if your walls get broken, you're not just instantly cooked. With characters like Wattson, you can hide your utility in spots that make them hard to destroy. With Rampart though, if it's not in the enemy's line of sight, it's not doing anything for you, which makes them prone to being destroyed, and you'll need enough gear to be able to survive long enough to get your stuff set back up. Rampart has seen flashes of success here and there in competitive play, but teams don't end up sticking to her for very long. I couldn't really give you a solid reason for that, it's just something I've kind of noticed. Overall, I think Rampart is in a fine state at the moment. I do think she's underplayed, but only for Broken Moon. On other maps, I think she's neither OP nor underpowered. Just a character I think you'd really only pick if you think their abilities are fun. Finishing out C tier, we have one of my favorite legends, Seer. When he was released, he was one of the most broken characters of all time. Then they nerfed every ability, so literally nobody played him. Then a random guy with no tournament experience qualified for the 2022 championship and won MVP, playing only Seer, which caused him to go from being the lowest pick rate character to the highest. Then, after a year or so, Respawn decided the Seer meta was over, they had enough, and nerfed him into the dirt, where he still lies to this day as one of the least picked characters in the game. Information is the most valuable thing in a battle royale, and all 3 of Seer's abilities focus on giving him or his team info on enemy players. His passive allows him to scan enemy players through walls, giving him a general idea of the direction they're in, which is what's used to aim his tactical, a tunnel-shaped skill shot that temporarily stuns enemy players. His tactical has received probably the most changes of any ability in the game. It's been buffed, nerfed, and reworked so many times it's hard to even keep up with what it all does at this point. Seer's ultimate is a small disc that, when thrown, creates a large dome that goes through walls. The dome scans anyone that is moving or shooting inside of it and reveals them to Seer and his teammates. It's also another way that Seer can aim his tactical. Seer's ult has a short throw range and can be easily destroyed, so it can sometimes be difficult to get a good location to place. This usually requires Seer to be either already on top of the enemy or be on the defensive to get value out of it, which is much different than similar characters like Crypto or Bloodhound, who can get a wide scan from very far away. One thing that's interesting about Seer is that in his competitive history, he He's been played in almost every way possible. There's been the Valkyrie Wattson Seer comp from early rotate POIs like Landslide and Harvester. There's been heavy team fighting comps like Seer Horizon Catalyst from POIs like Lightning Rod or Lava City. It doesn't sound that odd, but it's pretty rare for a non-rotation based character to fit in polar opposite playstyles. He's pretty flexible and is rarely a bad pick for a team. If your teammates are Wraith Valkyrie, you'd get almost zero value from playing an Octane or a Pathfinder, or if your teammates were Gibby Caustic, you wouldn't want a triple stack defense and play Newcastle. But with Seer, information gathering is something you can never get enough of. A popular ranked comp for a long time was a squad that had 2 scan characters with Bloodhound and Seer, paired with Horizon, just doubling up on info gatherers. That being said, all 3 of those characters were just overpowered. There really wasn't much synergy between them. Horizon just decimated and Seer Bloodhound gave you an information advantage, so you'd never get caught off guard. If you haven't experienced the misery of a 3-stack Apex Predator team, Bloodhound ulting, Seer ulting you at the same time, be thankful because that was one of the most oppressive and unfun combos in the history of the game. How are you supposed to win a fight against getting Horizon ulted while you're on double wall hacks? You're just getting cooked. And even though I think Seer's prime is likely far behind us, I still think he's very viable, and there was even a few people playing him to decent success in recent Pro League matches. He's not going to hold you back per se, but there's some characters higher up on the list that I would say are much better and more reliable options. Moving on to Fuse, I have him in the C tier. Fuse is another legend that is a niche but strong pick. Similar to Crypto, he isn't the most versatile character in the game, but he does his job well and can be a good fit for certain players and playstyles. His passive allows you to carry more grenades, which are an item that gets significantly more value the higher level lobby you're in. If there's more teams alive, then players on average have less space to move, which means grenades will be more punishing. His tactical is a grenade that detonates and makes multiple smaller explosions in the same area for a short amount of time. His ult creates a large ring of fire that slows and heavily damages any enemy that steps inside it. While his tactical and passive are very straightforward with little nuance, I do have a bit to say about the ultimate. For one, the hitbox on the flames is very low to the ground. You can't jump over the fire if it's on the same elevation as you, but even being like 2 meters higher than it allows you to jump clean over it. Also, for maybe half a second after the fire hits the ground, it doesn't do anywhere close to full damage, so you can just run through it a lot of the time. His ultimate has one other use that has existed for quite a while but has seen little adoption. Any enemy inside Fuse's ultimate is permanently scanned, and there are a few ways you can abuse this. My favorite being to place an evac tower near your enemies, then fire your Fuse ult at the top of the balloon. This will cause the fire to spread out an insane amount, increasing the scan radius. It's also bugged a little and will scan people even outside of the ult for a few meters. Firing it at any object in the sky will cause it to spread more, but the evac tower is the most OP and most consistent. If there was ever a Fuse meta, I'm sure this would become more mainstream and get patched shortly after. You can also zoom in while aiming the Fuse ult in tactical. One trick that you can do to get better aim is to decrease your FOV to 70, then fire your abilities and swap back to the one you originally used after you're done. This, however, is rarely worth the effort, but it does make it substantially easier to aim. However, if they're that far away where you'd want to do this, hitting them probably isn't going to be too important anyways. Fuse gets most of his value in the end game. His abilities essentially allow him to create a radius of unplayable space with extra nades, the clusters, and his ring of fire. So the less playable space people have, removing it becomes even more impactful. If you're in a game and there's 10 squads alive round 2, getting useful damage can be quite hard because there isn't usually much stopping someone from just moving out of the way. But if you're in a ring 5 with 6 squads left, suddenly a 15-meter wide ring of fire becomes a death sentence in a lot of scenarios. So if you're playing Fuse, similar to Caustic, you're just playing to get him to the end game and ability dump on a team to get a free elim. The only reason I don't have Fuse higher on the list is because he is one of the most map-dependent characters in the game. Olympus, Broken Moon, and Stormpoint aren't great for him. Olympus and Broken Moon are far too open, and it's incredibly hard to get value unless the ring is really small. Stormpoint is way more compact, which is what Fuse wants. However, the way the map is designed, their elevation is constantly changing, which makes it easy to find ways to jump over the ult, and the designs of the rocks and crevices have so many bends and weird geometry that it makes it hard to hit a good knuckle cluster a lot of the time. King's Canyon and World's Edge, he gets a lot of value because there's a lot more compact areas and the geometry of the rocks is easier to get cluster value. I would put him higher on the list, but due to map dependency and him only being useful when people are actually trying to win, I think C tier is fair. Alter is the newest legend among the cast, and so far there's a lot of mixed opinions on where she belongs on the tier list. Personally, I would say she's low B tier for now. Alter's passive allows her to loot a single item from death boxes from a large distance. As far as passives go, this ability is actually really solid. Being able to pull bats, gold items, and ammo from boxes without taking any risk is great. You can also poach items from people. A few times when I was playing, I'd watch a team finish a fight and I'd steal the best stuff before they got a chance to loot them. In endgames with lots of people, you'll get a lot of value out of this passive. passive, it's not uncommon to be able to poach multiple gold helmets or gold knockdowns. There will also be scenarios where it'll be helpful just to find loot. Sometimes you'll be walking through an area and you'll see a bunch of boxes light up through a wall that you wouldn't have found otherwise. Alter's Tactical lets her place a portal through an object for a brief period. After exiting, you'll be in the void. This ability has a lot of practical uses. Other than the obvious case of just getting through a wall, it can be used to kidnap people hiding behind stuff. You can put it as a trap so people can't cross terrain. You can use it to dodge abilities like Bangalore ult. I mean, it's an incredibly versatile ability. One thing I've tried but had a hard time getting to work was using it as a bait, just throwing it on a wall, then running around the wall. Alter's ultimate is a totem that after being placed will allow each player to teleport to it a single time. This leaves open a rift that after a few seconds can be taken by enemy players as well. This ability is super useful in high chaos environments like pubs and lower quality ranked games. My best advice for the totem is to try and not save it. If you're going to push someone or take a fight, just throw it even if you think you won't need it. If somebody gets rolled or a third party pulls up, just call them to your team to take it back and just full reset. I like carrying thermites on Alter because if people try and chase through the rift, you get a juice or thermite guaranteed that will also kind of flashbang them when they walk through it. Another thing I will say regarding her place on the tier list is that it takes time for people to learn how to get the most out of character abilities, and this can take longer than you think. With Horizon, for example, it took literal years before she saw the kind of play rates she deserved, and that was with being nerfed multiple times leading up to that. I have alternate B tier for now, but I'm not entirely convinced that she doesn't have a higher ceiling that people just haven't figured out how to tap into yet. As of right now, there isn't really anyone playing her in high level ranked or scrims, but like I said, it might just take time for people to learn the character. Another example is that the way people play Wraith nowadays is much different than how they played her years ago, even though the character has changed very little over that time. I think thematically, however, there are a few things going against Alter. Her abilities don't buff her or her teammates, and they don't directly impact an enemy very often. Two of the most picked characters at the most recent LAN tournament were Bangalore and Caustic because their ults have heavy direct impact. Getting Caustic or Bangalore ulted is an instant direct shock to an enemy team. Alter has very little of that. However, ranked is obviously much different than competitive. Hypermobility is incredibly important, and Alter provides that to the entire team, but it's not as easily used as, say, a Pathfinder grapple or Revenant pounce. So for now, I have Alter in low B tier. Only a few weeks after Valkyrie's release, the pick rates of every other rotate character fell off a cliff. And only a few weeks after evac towers were released, Valkyrie fell off a cliff as well. I do think that even with her being essentially replaced by a survival item, she still brings enough value to a team to be worth considering. Valkyrie's passive is one of the best in the game, giving her access to a jetpack that can be used to ascend even some of the tallest structures in the game. You can't just shoot while you're using it though, which was something I was kind of expecting when she was released, but I guess it makes sense for it to require both of her hands to use. The tactical has become a decent but forgettable ability. It sends out a missile swarm that temporarily stuns and damages enemies, but aiming it is kind of hard unless you have a higher elevation than them. The missiles can also easily miss depending on the terrain you're firing it at. The main reason you play Valkyrie, however, is for her ultimate. Valkyrie's ultimate sends you and your team rocketing into the air, allowing for what is basically a more reliable evac tower. This ability flipped Apex Legends on its head when it was released. Gatekeeping teams and choke points was no longer a viable option, and the large rocks on the map that were supposed to funnel teams into certain areas were no longer a death trap. Valkyrie was one of the most dominant characters in Apex for a long time, and I think she might have the most LAN wins of any character at the moment, but I'm not too sure on that. Regardless, what's important is where she's at now. I think she's in a good spot, like I said before. Evac towers replaced her ultimate in a lot of scenarios, and pro teams transitioned away to using things like Bangalore with 3 evac towers to get around the map instead of relying solely on Valkyrie. However, Valkyrie's ultimate is more reliable than an evac tower, and with the current perks she has, it goes a lot higher as well. Evac towers are also not guaranteed, and Respawn has been slowly lowering the spawn rate of them over time, so I would expect her to become more popular if the spawn rates of evac towers keep going down. If you're near the top right of the map on Storm Point, there's a pretty insane ultimate you can do. Ulting out of this opening near the command center cannon will send you so high in the air you can fly all the way to Echo HQ. There used to be a strat also where you could Ash portal to the top of the mountain above the cannon, then Valk ult, and I'm pretty sure you could fly literally anywhere on the map that you wanted. This became impossible when Respawn removed the option to use abilities while in and out of bounds, which was definitely a good change. One of the downsides of Valkyrie for ranked especially is that the safest place to be is usually wherever you're at right now. It's the area that you have the most knowledge on. When you take a Valk ult, you're telling the whole lobby where you are, and you're potentially heading in a direction where you have very little or no knowledge of. The only exception really being if you scanned a player beacon. The amount of times I've Valk ulted from a perfectly safe spot into an area I thought was better, only to land in the middle of an absolute circus, is more than I can count. That's why I tend to stay away from her in favor of doing slower, more predictable rotates with characters like Bangalore or Pathfinder. If you're playing Valkyrie, you should try to never let yourself take a bad fight and die for it. If the fight is bad, just Valk ult. If the rotate is bad, just Valk ult. And my advice for Valk ulting is that you don't always have to go go for the best spot you know of. Just looking for any spot that you know will be safe for at least one more ring is fine. Dying while going for God spot on Valk is one of those things where it's like, if I had a nickel for every time it's happened, I'd be rich. So just land anywhere you can think you won't instantly get smoked, and look for another Valk ult or some proactive play in the meantime. It takes some practice to learn how to Valk ult consistently, and I'm not too good at it myself, but overall I do think she's a solid character, especially for people who are struggling to safely rotate around the map. Next up is Caustic, and this is where I would start considering legends to be actually good. Caustic's tactical throws a barrel trap that once activated sends out poison gas in a small radius around it until it is either destroyed or times out after a few seconds. His ultimate is a grenade that sends out the same gas but in a much larger area. The gas does damage every second and impairs the vision and movement of anyone inside it. Caustic's passive allows him to see through the gas and also not be affected by his own or enemy caustic gas. He's a relatively simple character and his game plan has always been the same. Acquire as much loot as possible, use your barrels to dissuade people from pushing you, then throw your ult in the round 6 ring and just win the game. Caustic's abilities and numbers get tweaked quite a lot because he's a very popular pick for pro players, but nothing about his playstyle has ever really changed. He's the best character in the game at taking space from someone, especially if the space you want to take is small and or in an enclosed area. In professional play and during some of the better ranked splits, you often have very little space to work with during the later half of the game, so any ability that can force space is going to be very strong. There's only two things in the game that can counter Caustic ult, and that's a Wattson gen or another Caustic, which has the side effect of Caustic's pick rate fluctuating a lot more than other characters. If people are dying to Caustic a lot, they'll swap to Caustic to not be affected by the gas, so there's more Caustics, and then suddenly Caustic is one of the most picked characters and everyone hates playing the game. So people start picking counters to Caustic, and since there's so many Caustic counters, people stop playing him, and so on and so forth. It's an interesting dynamic for sure. Caustic has found success in a lot of different comps over the years, but all of them have the same goal, and that's just to get him to round 6, like I said earlier. It started with comps like Wraith Crypto Caustic in season 4, then went to Wraith Gibby Caustic, then it became Valk Gibby Caustic, and now with evac towers, people are dropping the Valkyrie and playing Bangalore Bloodhound Caustic. I think in almost any meta that's Caustic heavy, there's a huge opportunity to just counterpick it with Wattson, and that way your whole team can dodge the ultimate and not just one person. I've talked mainly about comp in this segment, but the reality is Caustic is pretty bad for pubs, and recently the rank splits have been so uncompetitive that hyper aggression is just the winning strategy. Caustic becomes stronger the less space people have, similar to Fuse. Right now the games aren't really sweaty enough for him to get that value. If it's round 3 with 6 squads left, what is your Caustic supposed to do? They're not forced to walk near his traps, and his ult is so small compared to how much space teams usually will have that it makes it hard to find a good chance to use it. Even more so if a team is in a field and not in a building. Still, I think he's decent for rank. It's just that you kind of need to play like a big baby and play almost purely for wins over elims. If you square up against a Revenant Conduit Bloodhound team, you're just going to get smoked if it's not in a very enclosed area, and if your building has multiple doors, it's just GG's. The plus side to this hyper aggression ranked meta though is that almost nobody is playing Caustic or Wattson, so there won't be any way to counter your abilities. In conclusion, great for tournaments, good for ranked, and pretty bad for pubs. Catalyst is a lot stronger than people give credit for, and I think part of that is that they are noticeably weaker than where they used to be. Seer went through a similar thing when he was released. He was turbo broken at launch, got nerfed a week or two later, then went almost unplayed for around a year before he shot up to a near 100% pick rate in competitive lobbies and high level ranked. I don't think Catalyst is Seer strong. I just think that it might take some time for people to start picking them up again. Catalyst's passive and spike traps are obviously very strong when trying to hold a position in zone, but they're also good for 1v1s and during highly chaotic scenarios. Reinforcing a door delays people so much even if they have a nade to blow it off, and a well-placed spike trap can make it impossible for someone to push through a doorway without having to tank it and be vulnerable for a decent period of time. Catalyst's ultimate is the reason you play them though. It's the largest line of sight block in the game, and it impairs enemies who try to cross through it. It's fairly multi-purpose as well. You can catwall sketchy cross, you can throw it at your enemies to try and split them up, you can use it to completely block off a path you know an enemy wants to take or is forced to use. If you force someone to have to run through a catwall, it's essentially a free one clip. The slow and vision impairment it gives makes the game almost unplayable. The main reason to play Cat in my opinion is they're a defensive character that offers lots of offensive and rotation options. You can use Cat to lock down a building and play safe and slow, but there's also plenty of ways to use them in a creative way to get offensive or rotational utility out of them. Prior to receiving huge nerfs, Catalyst was almost a must pick in professional play, being paired with characters like Bangalore and Horizon. There's not really much you can do to stop a team from pushing you or taking space when they throw 2 smokes, a bang ult, and a catwall at you, on top of having a Horizon for almost instant vertical movement. One of the most OP things about Catalyst is how much space they control in endgames, especially in round 6. In round 6, you can literally cut the circle in half or cut off a corner of the circle and create a small pocket for your team to play in, while the other teams are forced to beef with each other. Catalyst was super meta for a really long time and is undeniable undeniably one of the most frustrating characters to play against. Any character that focuses on disabling and removing options from an enemy player can get annoying. Caustic, for example, is very frustrating because once you're in it, I mean, you're just cooked. You can't see and you're slowed. It's just a mess and not really fun. Catalyst passive and tactical stops people from playing the game, and the impairment on the catwall is just insane, especially when you're in a bank smoke and a catwall at the same time. It literally looks like your monitor or your TV just turned off. It's so dark, I can literally see my reflection in my monitor. In their current state, I would only recommend Catalyst if you need a ring scan. With evac towers being so common and teams bringing so much fighting power in their comps nowadays, Cat's rotating ability isn't really as needed, and you're better off bringing a character with more punch like Caustic, or trying to stop enemy utility entirely with a Wattson gen, as an example. Horizon has probably received more nerfs in a row than any other character in the game. Even with the addition of legend perks, they nerfed her and the perks just revert those nerfs. The patch literally buffed every character except her, and there's several good reasons for why she's been going through that. Horizon's passive removes landing stun when falling from far heights, as well as slightly improving aerial mobility, which she definitely needs because her tactical places a gravity lift that can easily reach the top of most buildings and some cliffs. Accuracy is greatly reduced in her tactical for most weapons. It's supposed to be all weapons, but the devs are a little forgetful sometimes, so cut them some slack. The duration of it is quite long and can be extended for a few extra seconds if a player jumps in it just before it's about to end. Horizon's ultimate throws a black hole that takes a small amount of time to activate upon landing. It can be destroyed fairly easily, and at the moment it has 175 HP, but that is subject to change. It can also be destroyed by friendly fire and grenades. People used to throw the ult, then spam like 5 arc stars, so to counteract that, they added friendly fire plus nade damage so that it wasn't as overpowered. One of the best qualities Horizon has that makes her so consistently high tier is that her abilities are multi-purpose. Lift has so many uses. I mean, you can block doors, you can throw it at people if you think they're about to swing a corner. If someone's on a tower, you can throw it under them to launch them off. You can throw it at a down teammate to try and flood them to cover. The possibilities are almost endless. The ultimate can be used creatively, but not as crazy of an extent as the tactical. Her tactical provides strong team mobility, allowing her team to play low ground spots that would be bad for a traditional comp. At any moment, you can just lift up and retake high ground. There's been plenty of games I've won from playing an ultra low ground spot and just Horizon lifting up to third party the final fight to win the game. Horizon has good matchups into a lot of defensive legends and legends that have damage skill shots like Fuse. Her tactical can get you out of so many abilities: Gibby ult, Caustic ult, Fuse ult, and even just regular grenades. She's also one of the few legends in the game that I think benefit from being on one input over the other. Now guys, don't unsubscribe, don't flame me in the comments. I'm not another MK player complaining about controller, I swear. I think it's a legend that's notably better for MK players, which I'll get into later. Anyways, one of the downsides of playing a controller is that your movement isn't as good as a mouse and keyboard player, so Horizon's increased aerial mobility and tactical can help compensate for this difference. On the other hand, Horizon's ult is much harder to dodge on controller. You have limited time to destroy before it pulls, so the increased flicking speed of MK has a small advantage, as well as overall smoother movement if you're just trying to dodge it instead. I do have a few interesting things I want to say about the team comps that I've never heard anybody mention before, and that's that you generally don't want to pair Horizon with characters that have large hitboxes. Moving up the tactical can be free shots for your enemies at certain times, so giving your opponent the smallest target possible will benefit you. Conduit is also good paired with Horizon because the tactical will heal you while you're in the air, although sometimes it gets wasted because people like to pop bats in the lift because it's hard to shoot, so you might as well heal instead. Horizon is a very complex character, and I could probably talk about her for an hour, but just to sum it all up, I would say she's incredibly versatile, fits into quite a few different team comps and playstyles, and her abilities have multiple different uses. Part of what makes characters like Ashe bad is that their abilities have only 1 to 2 uses. With Horizon, I mean, she can do a million things with her abilities, and that's why she's been so strong even through multiple nerfs. At the top of B tier, I have Lifeline. Lifeline has jumped around a lot in the meta over the years, from being a must pick to completely useless, to nowadays being what I'd say is a relatively healthy state. Lifeline's passive is her signature ability, and the main reason you'd pick her in the first place. Attempting to revive your teammate will cause your drone to start auto-reviving, allowing you to shoot and move around freely. It is also affected by the gold revive, which revives your teammates at half HP and shield if Lifeline has one when the res finishes. This ability sounds really good, but similar to Newcastle, abilities that only really get value once you're already losing generally aren't that good. It's almost like you're planning on losing when you play her. In the past, it used to grant a massive green revive shield when reviving, but that was removed for being too OP. Lifeline's tactical is forgettable and pretty mid. It drops a drone that heals the health points of anyone nearby. It is also very loud, and if you're using it, your enemies can hear it from 10-20 meters plus away. It's good for throwing on top of a teammate while you're rezzing them so they can stand up and immediately pop a bat, or for healing yourself after coming out of the zone. Lifeline's ultimate calls down a care package that has seen quite a lot of balance changes over the years. It went from being completely useless to getting slowly buffed and buffed over the years to where it's at now. It has 3 sides that each spawn batteries plus needed gear upgrades upgrades for your team. Currently, Lifeline has a purple perk that grants you 1 OP package that contains a guaranteed gold knockdown shield and gold backpack. Gold knockdown shield obviously being incredibly strong on Lifeline, as it is on any revive character. Previously, the buff package could spawn a care package weapon, and that was a nightmare. Every game felt like it had 5 wingmans and 5 cravers in it. Thankfully, that was changed in favor of a more consistent and less OP option. I think people would have expected me to put Lifeline higher on the list, but like I said, it kind of boils down to a why would you plan on losing when you could plan to win type scenario. Lifeline will really only be useful when you're losing, whereas a character like Horizon will be useful if you're winning or losing. Not a perfect example, but you get what I'm trying to say. One thing I will say though is that I'm basing this mostly off a top player's perspective. If you're playing in lower ranked games or pubs, people are going to be far worse at punishing the Lifeline res. Lifeline has been out since the release of the game, so top players have had plenty of time to learn how to play around the res and how to stop it effectively. Noobs, on the other hand, will have a much harder time, and she's honestly a character I'd recommend for new players. One thing I want to touch on that I don't see people do very often is canceling the res. If you're being res by Lifeline and you know you're going to get thirsted or naded or just smoked, you can stop the res yourself and block the nade to give your teammate a shield to play. You can even use this to bait people in. Starting the revive, then canceling it as soon as they swing will give you a knockdown shield advantage on the person pushing you. This is hard to coordinate if you're solo queuing, but for team play, it's a nice strategy. Overall, decent and strong for newer players. If you're a top player, in my opinion, you're better off playing something that can create advantage instead of trying to lessen your opponent's advantages. Pathfinder is a character I used to have a lot lower on my lists, but recently I've started to like him a little bit more. His passive reduces the cooldown of his ultimate and gives him some charge back when he scans a care package. His tactical, as I'm sure you know, is his signature grapple ability. This ability is his whole identity and what keeps people playing him so much over all these years. His ultimate creates a zipline from where you're standing to wherever you're looking. He also has some perks that I want to touch on, which I haven't talked about too much in this video because they're the most susceptible thing to being outdated. So I've tried to stay away from talking about them unless they're really important. His current perks allow him to choose which beacon he wants to scan at blue, and the option between either a grapple reset on knock or a zipline that gives 50% damage reduction for a few seconds. All 4 of these perks are insane. I recommend taking the player scan if you don't have one on your team, and take the ring scan if you already have a player scan. Then for your purple perk, take the grapple reset if you're solo queuing, and the zipline buff if you're with a team. These add so much versatility to Pathfinder, it makes me so happy. In competitive Apex, sometimes characters are chosen for the sole purpose of having a beacon scan, so the fact you get to choose which one you want is amazing. The grapple reset is goated for obvious reasons. They allow a bunch of fun stuff to happen. The buff to zipline allows for some of the coolest plays I've ever seen. The amount of times I've been in the worst spot ever and I just tell my team, guys, jump on the zipline, we'll boost out of here, and we're just flying by as the whole lobby is blasting us. It's happened so many times and it's just so fun to watch and it's so fun to be a part of. Whoever cooked up Pathfinder's perks needs a raise because they just went nuclear with these abilities. But anyways, that's a bit of a tangent. Pathfinder's clear weakness is his large hitbox and lack of any ability that can directly affect an enemy player or your team. He doesn't have anything OP like a Caustic ult or Wattson gen or a Maggie drill that can make the difference in an endgame. It's just raw gun skill, which is why you never really see him played in tournaments. You get most of your points in the final few minutes, so you generally want to bring 3 characters who can excel during that time. So if we're in a meta like we're in right now, where there's lots of action in the early to mid game for ranked, Pathfinder's extreme mobility and ability to scan ring console is incredibly valuable. I think this is the best Pathfinder has been in probably 3 to 4 years, and I'm really excited to see it. He's a low frustration character to play against, and he's super duper fun to play. Just the perfect character in my eyes. He's also taller than most characters, which lets him get good head glitches, and he's incredibly mobile, so his large hitbox is rarely an issue in the early stages of the game. I've been glazing Pathfinder a lot, but like I said, really his only downside is his weak end game. I don't expect him to get any sort of rework soon, so this will likely be a problem he always has to deal with. But if you're playing in a game mode where end games aren't very important, then by all means, Pathfinder is easily S tier. But considering that weakness, I think A tier is fair. Bangalore is a legend I've mentioned quite a few times so far in this video, and for good reason. She is one of the most versatile characters in the game. She's good for pubs, for ranked, whether it's sweaty or not, and she's good for competitive. There's a few reasons, but I'll talk about her abilities first. Bangalore's passive is one of the best in the game. Being fired at while sprinting grants a temporary speed boost. This has so many uses, it's hard to even name them all. Sometimes you can also get the speed boost right before you pull your weapon, and you'll have the speed boost for a bit while you're fighting, but doing this on purpose is too hard to be worth trying to replicate consistently. Bangalore's tactical fires a smoke grenade, and she can have the 2 smokes stored at one time. Smoke Smoke grenades are just OP in every shooter really. Similar to Horizon's Tactical, there are just an infinite number of uses. You can smoke a down teammate, you can smoke a strong angle enemy is holding, you can put smokes in front of you when rotating, you can smoke your feet to run away. It's just such a versatile ability. The smoke also has a very weak scan attached to it. If both you and an enemy are in smoke, there'll be a small white outline on both of you. The range on this appears to be 18 meters, but requires 2 different smokes to get anywhere close to that range. Bangalore's ultimate places a field of missiles that detonate after a short amount of time. This ability can be so oppressive in the right scenario. Using it defensively essentially grants a free reset of a fight, and using it offensively gives you a free push. The missiles blow up in a line starting from bottom to top, so if you're pushing with it, you can move forward while the enemy is still hiding, waiting for their missiles to blow up so they can peek. If you're running away, you can throw it at your feet and you'll be able to outrun your own missiles just barely, which will create a lot of distance between you and whoever is chasing you. Bangalore's abilities are such a strong combination of survivability, rotational power, and area control that she can be picked in essentially any team comp in any game mode. Bangalore can be countered by a few characters though. Some characters have movement abilities that allow them to easily dodge bang missiles or just block them entirely. Wattson Gen also counters both of Bangalore's abilities. The smokes to a lesser extent because it can only destroy the initial projectile. The only reason I don't have Bangalore higher is that her abilities aren't guaranteed value often enough. The ultimate doesn't hit indoors, and the smokes are equally usable by both you and your enemy, and sometimes you can go entire games without getting any good smoke value. With a character like Bloodhound, for example, who I think is a little stronger, you're literally just spamming your scan as soon as it's up because it's so OP. Overall, an incredibly versatile and fun legend. I think she's in a really healthy spot right now, and I wouldn't want to see her nerfed too much, if at all. The next legend on the list is Conduit. Conduit is one of my favorite characters, and for good reason. She's really good at fixing your teammates' mistakes. Conduit's passive gives you a speed boost while running toward your teammates who are far away. At face value, this looks like a solo queue feature that lets you catch up to your teammates who aren't well coordinated, but you can actually use this for some tactical purposes. If there's an evo canister far away, you can send your Conduit to grab it and use the speed boost to get back. It also makes it slightly easier to get in range of your teammates who need your tactical. Conduit's tactical heals the shields of our teammates and herself for a few seconds. At launch, this was the best ability in the history of the game in my opinion, but it's been nerfed quite a few times since then and might get more in the future. Shield is the most valuable resource in the game, so anything that can regenerate it is going to be very strong. Pairing Conduit with really aggressive characters like Revenant and Horizon let you take advantage of this ability really well. You also almost never want to use it on someone before they take damage. I've seen people make this mistake a lot. You're just wasting it every second they're not being healed by it. It's also really important in my opinion to calm if you're going to use it before your teammates actually need it. Saying something like, I'm healing first damage, for example, lets your teammates know to play around the healing. The amount of times I use my tactical on someone, but they didn't know I was going to heal them, so they just start popping a cell or a bat and end up wasting it is too high to count. You also want to try your best to save it if you don't think your teammate will actually need it. If someone is 80 meters from an enemy and they get hit 80 damage, just let them pop a bat. Don't waste a tactical. Save it for emergency situations or when you'll both need it. Conduit's tactical heals her teammates way more than her, so try to prioritize using it on your teammates instead. Conduit's ultimate places multiple electric nodes in a straight line. If enemies get too close, they're slowed and take a small amount of damage. As of right now, the nodes can only be destroyed by enemy bullets. This ability is a little wonky to get used to, but it's pretty solid in endgames and for keeping teams away. One trick people don't do enough is you can hide behind them for kind of a weak head glitch. It'll usually block a few bullets, especially if you're crouch spamming. Conduit is one of the best characters in the early game, especially on blue armors. When everyone is red armors and has 6 bats, the tactical isn't as needed, but in the first few minutes of the game when people don't have a lot of meds and fights tend to be a little more chaotic, our tactical and passive get a bunch of value. Our 2v2 and 1v1 is one of the strongest in the game, so it's better to stay in the back as Conduit so you can heal either of your teammates and make sure you're the last alive. If it gets down to a 1v1, it's best to just play ultra safe and go for a short trade, then use your tactical to heal and re-push with an HP advantage. This is really oppressive in 1v1, and it's one of the many reasons that Conduit is a great character. The final character I have in A tier is Wattson. I think a lot of people will disagree with me on this one, but I genuinely believe she is incredibly strong in all game modes. I think she was pretty bad for a few years up until they added legend perks to the game. Wattson's perks are incredibly strong and have breathed life back into the character. I think she's easily a top 5 character and debatably top 3, which is where I have her. Wattson's passive has multiple parts to it. She can carry 2 ultic cells per slot, and using 1 ultic cell will fully charge your ultimate. She also has a very small passive shield regen. The buffed ultic cells do a lot of work, especially in super competitive lobbies. Teams will try to focus her ultimate, so always having one on standby will negate their efforts. The slow shield regen could be removed, and it wouldn't affect her place on the tier list. It is noticeable, but in my opinion, you should really just pretend it doesn't exist unless you're really low on meds. If you're playing a tournament or a sweaty rank game and you're just waiting for zone to close, you can give your Wattson a damaged armor and just have them chill in a corner and heal it while everyone else pokes. It's a nice bonus and it feels good, but it's not really that important. Wattson's tactical places a node that, if connected, creates an electric fence that does solid damage and stun anyone who walks through it. The fences are mostly deterrents, if anything. There aren't many places in the game where a fence can completely block someone from crossing through a choke point without being stunned. They can usually stand to the side and hit one of the nodes, then just run through the choke point. Although they're not useless, it does take some time to destroy them, and enemies have to give away their position if they want to shoot them. So even if they only end up buying you a few seconds, that is still valuable time. There's also a few tricks you can do with them by connecting them through doors to break and stun someone on the other side, but good players will rarely fall for these. Some of them are pretty nasty though, like this one you can do in Survey Camp. Wattson's ultimate, which I've talked about a lot so far in this video, places a generator that rapidly heals the shields of any player nearby. It also blocks any projectiles that come within a small radius. This is Wattson's best ability and hard counters many characters in the game. Gibraltar ult, Bangalore ult, Caustic ult, and more can all be completely negated by a well-placed Wattson gen. One team comp I really like for Wattson is Bangalore Conduit Wattson. This comp has so much survivability, and if you're well coordinated, you are so hard to eliminate. As soon as you're in danger, you just drop gen and everyone sits on it with the added heal of Conduit tactical. You can use the smoke to protect the generator, kind of. So even if you're in a spot where the gen isn't totally safe, you can place it inside the smoke and get a full reset off. I know my name is HisWattson, but I don't think the rating I have is too high or biased. In all fairness, I thought she was pretty bad for a really long time. Moving into the S tier, the character I believe to be the second best in the game is Bloodhound. Bloodhound has been a staple in the ranked meta for quite a few years, and it really just boils down to information being king. Bloodhound can scan the player beacon, and his passive lets him scan frequently spawning ravens to ping the direction of the nearest team. The bird only spawns if there isn't an enemy close by. The passive is mostly only useful during the early game because in endgames, everyone is too close together to scan the beacon or get a bird to spawn. His tactical is his signature scan ability that scans enemies in a massive cone in front of him. This is one of the best abilities in the entire game. Wall hacks in a game this fast paced is just insanity. His ultimate gives him a speed boost as well as turning your vision black and white, highlighting all enemies in red. What makes Bloodhound better than Seer for the scan role is the reliability and ease of use of his abilities. It's almost impossible to miss a Bloodhound scan. Speeding up fights is really important because even an extra second can mean the difference between a third party catching you lacking and you getting a full reset off. The way Bloodhound scans people I think is also very fair. It's a long cooldown and only stays on you for a short time no matter what. Compare this to Seer, who I do agree is unhealthy for the game if he's in a strong state. His passive can scan you infinitely and his ult is often difficult to destroy, leading to just 25 seconds of permanent no counterplay wall hacks. Bloodhound has seen lots of play in competitive Apex over the years, and for me, I'm glad. He's a fun character to watch, and despite what people say about him, I believe there are way more annoying characters that could be meta. He's been in a lot of different comps over the years. There's been Wraith Gibby, Octane Gibby, Valk Bang, Bang Caustic. Aurora was even playing a Lifeline Bang comp that looked really fun. It doesn't really matter what you play him in though. Information gathering characters will be useful no matter who their teammates are. The last thing I'll say about Bloodhound is that over the years, he's had a really OP part of his kit added and taken away multiple times, and that's the ability for his tactical to have a reduced cooldown while in his ultimate. This is insanely oppressive, and if it's in the game, then Bloodhound is probably very strong, but like I said, it's been in and out of the game a few times. Before I explain why I think Revenant is the strongest character in the game, I want to explain his abilities first, just in case. His passive gives you a weak scan on any low HP target. It's honestly pretty mid. His tactical allows you to jump a large distance after a short charge up time. His ultimate gives Rev a recharging 75 HP shield that resets after getting a knock or a small amount of time. Plain and simple, 75 HP that resets on knocks is just overpowered. Revenant has gotten his abilities hard nerfed multiple patches in a row, but that has not stopped him from being borderline unfair to play against. He's also insane at getting away to craft banners or just dodging a bad scenario in general. There isn't much nuance to playing him. His gameplay loop really just boils down to ulting before you're about to fight, then jumping on top of anyone who gets cracked. The enemy usually doesn't have any counterplay, especially on more open maps like Olympus. His kit, in my opinion, is pretty unhealthy for the game. Generally, characters are designed with strengths and weaknesses. For example, Gibraltar has the best offensive and defensive ability in the game, but he has a massive hitbox, so he gets punished very hard for misplaying with those abilities. Revenant doesn't really have any major weaknesses. He's an incredibly selfish character that gets to do basically whatever he wants and is almost impossible to punish. In tournaments where team play and doing damage with abilities is the meta, he doesn't get a lot of play at the moment, but in ranked and pubs, where you generally have more space to move around, he just absolutely decimates. One thing that's interesting about Revenant that you don't see very often is that he's the best character for 3 stacking and also solo queuing. Typically, how good a character is changes heavily depending on if you're with a coordinated team or not. But Revenant, he's just OP no matter what. With Revenant, you ideally want to pair him with legends like Conduit or Bloodhound, just something that can assist him in playing hyper aggressive. I would never want to play Revenant with a Wattson, for example. He's also really good at abusing weapons like the Havoc. Having extra HP helps counteract the windup just a bit. There's a few high elo Rev mains that like using the L-Star as well, but I haven't tested that myself, but I've seen it do well. The idea behind it is that you essentially never have to stop firing, so you get extra HP that resets on knocks, and you never have to stop shooting, so it sounds pretty devastating. I do expect him to get more nerfs in the future, but as long as his jump goes as far as it does, and he gets 75 HP at the click of a button, I think he'll be a strong ranked pick for a very long time to come. All right, so that's the list. My goodness, that took a long time. If you like this type of content, let me know, because I'm considering doing some similar stuff. The game will change as time goes on, of course, but most of the concept I've talked about will stay the same. More versatile legends will tend to be near the top, and characters with one-dimensional abilities or gimmicks will tend to be near the bottom. Might be a little late for this, but this is just my opinion. Feel free to debate any of my rankings in the comments section, but please try and be respectful to anyone else in the comments. Anyways, thanks for watching, have a great day, and thanks for being you.